So pray that he doesn't do anything to irritate it and make it any worse. Pray for my mother, the needs she has, and then she's the extra stress of taking care of my daddy. And anybody who knows my daddy knows what she's going through. But I love them both, and I appreciate what they've done for me and for our church, the sacrifices they made for our church. He'd much rather be here. He talked about coming today, but he's not. So Mama's going to stay home with him. Hopefully, we've signed her up to YouTube and subscribe to the church, so hopefully it's easy for them to find the services today as they try to watch. But I pray that it comes through clearly. We've upgraded the internet speeds and stuff to try to make it as clear as possible for as many as possible. But we have decent internet at home, so I know it's good internet here and good internet there, so technically it should work like it's supposed to. But you never know what happens between here and there. But be praying for those that are at home. Brother Russell and Miss Linda have still been having a lot of issues. Mama texted me this morning and said that Miss Linda's had some falls and had to go to the emergency room a couple times. So I'll be praying for them. I know Billy and Pam Horton are pretty faithful, and they've been sick, and they've had to have Billy at the hospital some this week. And this is just stuff that's coming in this morning. So be praying for them. The Creatures are traveling from Florida today. They went for Brentley's birthday. I always like to celebrate your grandkids' birthday, see as much as you can. So be traveling this morning, them and Cana. My dad's brothers, Jimmy and Claude, both have had health issues this week. Uncle Jimmy's been in the hospital with congestive heart failure, low oxygen. He finally got out on Friday. Then Uncle Claude, my dad's oldest brother, living brother, has got angioplasty and stents be scheduled. So the Dupree men of that family, that generation are suffering right now. And so they all have wives, so be praying for the wives and the kids as they face these battles. I know the battles that we face at home ourselves. We just need to keep our eyes on Lord. Give us the mercy and grace until you resolve the issue. A lot of times we have a thorn in the flesh. There was a Paul that had one and prayed for it 3 times, and God said, no, I'm just going to give you the grace to get through it. And that might be the case, and that might be where we're at, but we just need to rely on the grace that God can give us every day. This morning, we're going to continue on in our lesson about overcoming envy and political hardship. Last week went long. I'm not going to promise that I'm not going to go long again today. Just go back and do a quick review before we get started. I guess it helps if I turn this thing on. There we go. We see the map here between Jerusalem and Babylon, where Daniel and the children of Israel were taken into captivity. We'll talk about that a little bit more today. The timeline. So at this point, Daniel was probably in his mid-80s. And now we see first the Roman number 1 was the mandate against Daniel. They were out to get him. Then we talked about all we talked about last week was the introduction to this and the ungodly envy, how jealousy can destroy a person. The green with envy. I don't want to be that way. I need to be happy and content in the state that we are in. So this morning we're going to pick up on B, which is Daniel and his faithful testimony. Let's get our Bibles out and let's turn back open to Daniel chapter 6. Don't want to touch the microphone, makes too much noise. Set over the kingdom 120 princes, which should be over the whole kingdom, and over these 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was the first, that the princes might give account unto them, and the king should have no damage. Then this Daniel was preferred above the presidents and the princes, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king thought to set him over the whole realm. The presidents and princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find none occasion nor fault, forasmuch as he was faithful, neither was there any error or fault found in him. Then said these wise men, we shall not find any occasion against this Daniel, except we find it against him concerning the law of his God. We'll stop there. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we love you. We thank you for this day. Lord, it's been an interesting week with just our country, the tragedies we've had this week with the 2 plane crashes and the loss of life. And then think about those in our congregation and our church family that are sick and suffering this morning. But Lord, help us to remember to be faithful to them and to pray for them. A lot of times they're to the point they can't even pray for themselves. Help us to be faithful to pray for them, to remember them, and wish and pray for you to touch them according to your will and according to your way. Also think about preacher this morning that's much rather be here, but is not able to be here yet. Lord, I pray that you'll bless that situation to be met as expediently as possible. Give them the fortitude they need as they go through these trials. Give them the grace they need. Help us to be there for the support, morally, socially, prayerfully. But Lord, also now as we continue to talk about Daniel, and his testimony was impeccable. And Lord, help us to be challenged to live the same way. And also when we do things right, how that you will pray that you give us the strength to stand up and do what's right, even when it's hard and the whole world is out to get us. Bless our time this morning. They tried and they tried and they tried to find something against Daniel. They said they tried something politically. They couldn't find it. Couldn't find anything that he had done wrong. He had an impeccable testimony. You know, that's the type of people that we need running our country today, are people with impeccable testimonies. But how about as a Christian? We should strive to have nobody can say anything evil against us. They could search us out. They could check our browser history. They could check our view history at home. They can check our history, our locations of where we've been, what we've listened to on the radio, and we would be 100% without reproach. I confess, I'm not Daniel. I would strive to be, but I make mistakes. I have to confess sins. I'm not perfect. I am redheaded, and I can get upset, and my face turn as red as my hair. So I'm not quite there yet, but Daniel was an amazing man that kept his eyes on Christ. After 75 to 80 years in captivity, he still had a great testimony. They could find none occasion or fault in him, for as much as he in integrity. Integrity is the quality of being honest and having strong moral principles, moral uprightness. That's a testimony. In the heathen land where he suffered and been through all kinds of persecutions, he watched his friends be thrown into the fiery furnace and how God preserved them. But no matter how hard these other princes tried to find dirt on him, there was none to find. You know, the last 4 years have been, what was the term they came years ago about throwing dirt, muck rakers, mudslingers? How bad are our political systems today about throwing dirt on each other? Try to find something because they allegedly found things that places he shouldn't have been on the internet and made comments he should have made. You know, I don't know whether he did or didn't. But as Christians, we should have a testimony that they can't find any dirt like that on us. Daniel, they couldn't find any dirt on him at all. They tried. Our world that we live in, they throw things at people just to see if they can find something to stick. And as long as we've had politics, this has happened. But the problem was that these princes had, and the presidents had, they couldn't find anything. His integrity was impeccable. That's a good testimony. And I think we as Christians should strive to be that way. We just recently met Brother Tom over the last year or so, but he was a businessman. He had a company, and I'm sure he strived to have an impeccable testimony in his work, because if you didn't, you would lose business. Do we ever go back to places that don't serve us right, don't treat us right, or no, we don't. Because we have a testimony. And the same thing as Christians, we have a testimony. We need to live with an impeccable testimony. People that worked with Daniel intimately, daily, in and out, could not find a single hole in his character. We should strive to be that way. Can people say that about us? No, I've done confess some of my failures and faults this morning. Does the way we live match the way that we talk? There's a Pastor Parrick song, your walk talks louder than your talk talks. Does your actions speak louder than words? So we say, yes, I'm a Christian, yes, I do this, but do we live that way? Do we walk that way every day? When other people hear our name, hey man, he's a good person. He's got good integrity. He's got good scruples. You know, Proverbs 22 verse 1 says, a good name is rather to be chosen than great riches, and loving favor rather than silver or gold. Something we've tried to instill in our students over the years. It takes a lifetime to build a testimony, and it takes 5 seconds to destroy it. You know, if people could understand that today, it would be a different world. You know, I was talking last year sometime, we're trying to build a decent relationship with our local police department and they're a decent department. They're not perfect, but they come in and want to talk to the kids about safety and things. And I told this to one of the detectives, she said, hey, can I keep that? Can I use that? I said, yes, ma'am. So for more people that you know that way and live that way, the better off we'll be. We need to strive to keep that perfect testimony. We need to try to keep the skeletons out of the closets. So don't put any in there. They won't find any if there's none there. Because a good name is rather to be chosen than great riches, and loving favor rather than silver and gold. Daniel was found faithful. He would, no matter what the king asked him to do, he did it to the best of his ability, and as a result, he was put into the number 2 ruler over the kingdom. When we exercise faithfulness in little things, a lot of us try to help people and help them grow, and as we try to work with employees, give them responsibilities and see how well that they do. If they do well with little things, greater things will come along. You know, Luke chapter 16, verse 10 talks about that as Christians. It says, he that is faithful in that which is least, is faithful in something small, is faithful also in much. And he that is unjust in the least is unjust also in the much. Daniel was not perfect, but he had a testimony of faithfulness and integrity. We need to strive to have a testimony of faithfulness and integrity. So also, as we continue on, he was attacked by ungodly envy. These people were jealous. These 120 men were jealous of Daniel and how God had blessed him. And even through it all, he had a faithful testimony, a testimony of integrity. And as a result, they tried to do all they could to find anything against him, and they couldn't do it. They couldn't find anything against him. So they had to find something that they could do that they could get him in trouble. So they had to make something up. The only way that they could do anything to Daniel legally is to change the laws so that his spiritual consistency became illegal. Daniel 6:5 says, then said these men, we shall not find any occasion against this Daniel except we find it against him concerning the law of his God. They had to make something up, had to make a law, try to come up with something so they can get Daniel. They couldn't do it any other way except against God. This was, in reality, this was a ridiculous idea. They had to propose a law that anybody ask anything of anybody other than King Darius for 30 days will be cast into the den of lions. That has to be a really good setup, but can you imagine that having that law into place, and this is targeted for sure, and this over the years there have been laws that have been targeted primarily in Europe, not as much here in America, but people have made laws just for one person, or one group of people, specific things for them. And so they try to make up this law. But can you imagine, Mommy, I need something to eat. So technically, if the little boy or little girl asked Mommy, wanted something to eat, technically they could be thrown into the den of lions. How dumb is that? You think they're going to actually act out this law on anybody else other than Daniel? No, this was targeted for Daniel. They set this trap. And how did they get this trap set? They used flattery. They flattered the king. They're trying to stroke his ego to try to hide their true motives. Darius liked Daniel. If they knew that they were coming after him, do you think they'd be happy? He'd be happy about it? Nope. So they try to butter him up, try to deceive him, so he won't pay attention to what they're really doing. Sort of like the Wizard of Oz. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. They had an ulterior motive, and they used flattery to get there. The Bible tells us that flattery is a trap. Proverbs chapter 29, verse 5 says, "A man that flattereth his neighbor spreadeth a net for his feet." So somebody comes up flattering you, trying to butter you up for something, all they're trying to do is trip you up. Also, I had this thought as I was studying for this. You ever had your kid come up or your grandchild come up and give you a big hug and give you a big kiss and say, "Grandma, Grandpa, I love you"? And what do you think? What do you want? So we experience that. We understand it. Because there's times with Gracie the same way. I love her. But she comes up and gives me a big hug and a kiss on the cheek. It's like, Gracie, what do you want? Thing is, we have experience so we know to look for that. Darius, you would think, would have experience because he was the king of a great land. Had 2 million soldiers. 2 million soldiers is a whole lot of people that he's responsible for if you get wives and children and regular citizenry. But they used flattery to get to Darius, to get to his kicked into his pride. But they came together, and their plan worked, and they flattered Darius. He was so buttered up, he didn't see through their deceptive. Because they lied to him point blank, because it says, all the leaders of the kingdom have consulted together. All these people were there, but who wasn't there? He was so distracted that he didn't realize that Daniel wasn't there. Because they had flattered him up. They buttered him up so much. And of course, they hadn't consulted Daniel, because would Daniel do anything to get himself thrown into a den of lions? No, we have self-preservation as part of our ingrained mindset. So they set the trap. They had this law written, and now the only thing they had to do was Darius had to sign it. And what was significant about this law? It's the law of the Medes and Persians. Nowadays, on the last 2 weeks, we've had several laws written by presidents that have been undone. But the law of Medes and Persians was not that. Because once it was written and once it was signed, it was law, and there was no undoing. There were no executive order retractions. There were no voting in Congress to get the law changed. Once it was written, it was written. So it was said. Anybody that asks anything other than the king for 30 days shall be cast into the den of lions. So it was signed into law, and there was no way to change it. This law was so ridiculous, they can only be enforced against its target. This mandate Darius signed was a mandate against Daniel's faith. You know, we have to be aware that at some point there may be mandates against our faith. You know, we've seen them around the world. There are countries, China, Korea, other places where there are mandates against the Christian faith. How would we respond if something came after our religious liberty? Well, as I mentioned briefly last week, how would COVID? They tried to infringe on our religious liberty by telling us that we couldn't come to church and assemble. And most of us, well, there was some resistance, and there were actually some people that went to jail for it. But thankfully, we didn't have to. It was worked out that we could continue to come. Yes, we had to social distance, but that was just, like we mentioned last week, a flexing of the muscles. What happens if something comes along more invasive on our faiths? Or how would we respond? But things are happening. Daniel faced this mandate. He knew that if he didn't comply, he would die. There may be other mandates that we have that if we don't comply, we'll be punished. You know, about sharing the gospel. We talked about the folks outside abortion clinics getting arrested by simply standing there and silently praying. That's strong. There might be times we have to deal with this. I pray that we'll have the fortitude to be a Daniel and stand up against the government or whoever tells us, because we're supposed to worship and honor God first. So, first point was mandate against Daniel, and now we're getting into Daniel's ministry. We're not going to finish today either, y'all, so just bear with me. The ministry of Daniel. What did Daniel do when he faced this mandate written specifically to attack him? What did he do? He prayed. He prayed. You know, there's times that we'll face troubles, we'll face trials. But first thing we need to do, as Daniel did, would be pray. Pray for wisdom. Pray for God's intercession. Pray for God's protection. Daniel did. That's it. He prayed. He didn't pitch a fit and try to rally up the support of the empire. He didn't do an all-caps memo on Facebook about this is so unfair. Daniel chapter 6, verse 10 says, Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went into his house, and his windows being opened in his chamber toward Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he did, what's this next word? Aforetime. Nothing changed. The law against Daniel was written. If he got caught, he would be thrown into the den of lions. He didn't change. He went and prayed. We have experienced a great level of religious freedom in America. You know, part of our heritage is religious freedom. They got it in Holland, but the kids were becoming more like Hollanders instead of Christians, so they left there to come to America, the Pilgrims. So in our states, religious freedom, we initially had havens for Catholics and havens for Baptists, but overall, it became a point that everybody could have religious freedom to worship the way that they felt of God to worship, and there should not be any government interference. You know, separation of church and state is something we hear about all the time. But basically, it's not to keep the church out of the state, it's to keep the state out of the church. There shouldn't be any religion that should be promoted more so above others. I think as we get everybody on the same page, it won't be a problem. But the government, here we've had this tons of freedom. We should not take this freedom lightly, because at any moment it could happen. Do you think those folks on that airplane that crashed on Friday had any idea that within a minute and a half of takeoff they will be into eternity? You know, as quickly as that happened to them, something could happen to us, and those freedoms could be taken away. What would happen if we had an EMP or a solar flare that came in and wiped out all the electronics? Do we have any Bibles at home that are paper versions that we still can read? Think about that. We need to be prepared. But religious freedom is not something we should take lightly. We should hold to the gift of freedom gratefully and do all we can to protect it, to preserve our liberties through the unique process that we have been given. We can vote. We can support people. We could pray for elected officials. We can contact them. And as God leads, we could even be a politician ourselves. You know, there are people that Christians we need in politics. Miss Neve and I were talking before church. There's things about our president we just don't like. But can you imagine if we had a person that cares enough about America that was 100% sold out for Christ? How that could happen? You know, J.D. Vance has come up from poverty to be the vice president of the United States. He's worked hard. He's a religious person. But can you imagine what it would be if they didn't think about using God's name in vain, didn't think about drinking alcohol, didn't think about doing things with unscrupulously? We need to have people in places like that. And if they're not there, we need to pray for them so God can have the hand upon them and squeeze their hearts and then do what's right. But we need to be involved. You know, we should be loyal to America and loyal to our country. But our highest allegiance is to God. No matter where we're at, no matter how bad it may get, our allegiance and loyalty should be to God. And as a result, and our greatest commission is the Great Commission. We have been given liberty like nobody else in the world has ever experienced. And as a result, we need to be faithful with the Great Commission. Mark 16:15, he said to them, "Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature." Our greatest concern as ambassadors for Christ is not political, it's spiritual. No matter who's in charge, we have a spiritual mandate to be a witness. And we need to thank God for the liberty that we have and take advantage of it as long as we can to share the gospel of Christ. To preach it, to be able to not just preach today, but for your great-grandkids and your children's children and your children's children, for generations to come, will have freedom so they can be willingly, freely preach the gospel. You know, when it comes to our religious liberty, our greatest victories are not won in court. They're won on our knees in prayer. Prayer. We need to pray. Daniel prayed. You know, a lot of times we see people when they get upset, they do stupid stuff. They tear down, they burn down, they throw rocks, they turn over police cars, they rob, vandalize. Christians shouldn't do that. We don't need to duplicate their anger when something bad happens. We need to get on our knees and pray fervently in intercessory prayer for those around us and for God's will to be done to us. Daniel stood for God down on his knees. Do we do the same? Do we stand for God on our knees? How often do we pray? Daniel, we have letter A here. There was a planned prayer. He prayed. He knew what would happen if he prayed, and he did it anyway. He knew the law, but he consciously chose to obey God. Acts chapter 5, verse 29 says, "Then Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than men." You know, if Daniel figured if God could preserve me all these years in a foreign country, after being indoctrinated for all those years, God can preserve me out of a den of lions. He saw my friends in the fiery furnace. Well, it's not much worse than that. But he chose to obey God. We're not going to get through all these today, but I'm just going to keep going here. But there was 3 aspects to Daniel's prayer life. First thing we can notice was that it was public. He had a public prayer life. He could have thought, well, after he heard this law, he could have rationalized, well, it's just a month. I can just close my doors, close my windows, and pray privately. But he didn't. I don't want to be eating my lines. God still hears my prayers if I pray silently. He continued his public exercise of his faith. Does anybody remember Coach Joe Kennedy? You probably remember the story. He was a retired U.S. Marine that went home to his hometown to coach high school football. Before his first game, he made a personal commitment to God to, after each game, he would come to the center of the field and pray and thank God for the game, for the safety, for the victory, win or lose. He made that commitment to God. After each game, Lord, I'm going to come to the 50-yard line, center of the field, and pray. He would thank the Lord for the opportunity to coach and to be involved in these young people's lives. He'd pray for his players. After a while, some of the players said, Coach, can we come pray with you? Yeah. And the group started to grow. In 2015, there was an official from another school saw this and said, hey, man, this is really good. Let me write a letter commending the coach of doing this. Went to the school board read it, and you think they slapped him on the back and said, hey, good job? Nope. They said, if you don't quit, we're going to fire you. You can pray in the press box, you can pray inside the school, but you cannot pray publicly after the ball game on the field. So he had a choice to make. Am I going to honor my commitment to God, or am I going to worry about my job? He reached out to a law firm that specialized in this kind of religious liberty claims, and they said, no, Coach, you haven't done anything wrong. The school doesn't have any grounds to do anything against you. So he went back to the school board and said, hey, I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm not doing anything illegal, unconstitutional. I'm not going to quit. So what did they do? They fired him. They fired him for wanting to pray publicly, maybe not even out loud, but publicly in the center of the field after the ball game. This was in America in 2015. This began growing media attention, and people around the country had heard about it. I remember hearing about it. I didn't remember the time frame that happened, but I do remember this happening. But he knew if he didn't fight, this could be setting a very dangerous precedent for people in the public schools. And he wanted to fight for the rights that were constitutionally guaranteed to exercise the free religion, free exercise of religion. So if he didn't fight this could also hurt other people for the future. So he went to First Liberty Institute, and he filed a suit in court. Went through case after court case. The first one, the school won. It kept being appealed over and over and over again. So finally, on June 27th of 2022, the Supreme Court released its 6-3 decision deciding in favor of Coach Kennedy. So after took all the way to the Supreme Court for this man to fight for the rights of coaches and teachers in our public school systems to have the right to pray. He won. It was an ultimate, it was a case of victory for religious freedom. But it's also not difficult for us to understand that if it took from 2015 to 2022 to get it resolved, that there are a lot of people in the lower echelons of our judicial system that don't appreciate religious liberty. So we don't need to take what we have for granted. This man fought for us. We need to do everything we can to preserve and value religious liberty. This man personally sacrificed, fought for that right to pray. And ultimately he won, but how many battles did it take to get there? We need to be in prayer for our government and pray for the people that our president puts in these these courthouses as judges and prosecutors and defense people so that we can have our religious liberties preserved. You know, one of the most insidious lies that Satan will tell us is that taking a stand for Christ publicly will actually limit our opportunities to point others to him. That's not the case. As we see here, this man, thousands of people heard about Christ as a result of his willingness to fight. And timid Christians don't need to believe that it's distasteful to boldly share our faith. We need to boldly share our faith. And we don't need to be obnoxious about it, but we need to be bold about it. We need to be able to be willing to publicly identify with Christ and share the gospel. As we close this morning, think about the words of Paul, who was unashamed of the gospel of Christ. Romans chapter 1, verse 16 says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek." I am not ashamed. We don't need to be ashamed and be bold. Be bold in our faith. Not obnoxiously bold, but bold in our faith. We don't need to let Satan deceive us into believing that we should be ashamed of Christ. Christ has done everything for us. We don't need to be ashamed of what he's done for us. Be willing to share it. And even if we're threatened with a den of lions, we still need to do what's right, because the Lord's going to take care of us. What would have happened if he had been eaten by the lions? Where would he be? He'd be in heaven. And what's so bad about going to heaven? Pain won't last but so long. Suffering won't last but so long, but heaven is for eternity's sake. We need to be bold. We do not need to be ashamed of Christ. This morning, as we get into his types of prayer here, it was a public prayer, and next week we'll try to finish this lesson. I'm not going to promise, but we're going to try. But I encourage you to read this passage of Scripture in Daniel chapter 6, the first 28 verses. And maybe God will show you something he hadn't shown me or shown Pastor Chappell in this outline. But this morning we need to be bold. Heavenly Father, we love you. Thank you for this day. I pray you bless us now as we close today. This morning who knows what we're going to face this week. But Lord, help us to be bold in our faith, to be willing to stand up for what's right, even if it may cost us personally. Lord, you promise to be there with us each step of the way. And as we go through, help us to be willing to share the gospel, even as simple as passing out a tract. Lord, I pray that help us to be faithful to